Our evening is now going to continue with our guest speaker, Dr. Julian Tang. So Julian Tang is a consultant virologist at the Leicester Royal Infirmary and an honorary associate professor at the Department of Respiratory Sciences. Dr. Tang trained in medicine and zoology at Cambridge before completing a zoology PhD in biological fluid dynamics at Aberdeen. After his general medical training, he then completed his specialist clinical virology training at University College London in 2005. Later that same year, he moved to Hong Kong, which was shortly after the SARS 2003 outbreak, as an assistant professor, developing his clinical and research interest in respiratory viruses, particularly on influenza and its transmission. He later moved to Singapore in 2008 as a consultant virologist, arriving there just in time for the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic. There he built the sclerin imaging system to visualize human exhaled airflows, such as breathing, talking, coughing, sneezing, and singing, to aid aerosol infection control guidance. After several years in Singapore, he spent a couple of years working in Edmonton, Canada, where he described the first imported fatal human case of avian H5N1 influenza into North America in 2013. He returned to the UK in 2014, where he settled in Leicester, where he's been running the diagnostic virology laboratory there and advising on the clinical management of infection control of viral infections, particularly respiratory viruses like influenza and the SARS-CoV2, which is causing the current COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk, Chris. Chris and I met through a mutual friend who's based in Hong Kong, and he asked me to give a talk this evening for this medical society. I'm just going to turn off my video, hope that's okay, just to increase the bandwidth here. So basically the students are going to help me step through my slides because my Wi-Fi is a bit variable at the moment. So we just go to the next slide. And then the next one, that's just my introduction. So basically we have, we're assaulted by, a couple of, well, about 20 different respiratory viruses every season, including the common cold viruses, rhinovirus, coronavirus, influenza, parainfluenza, adenovirus, etc. And we can test for all of these now from one sample routinely with these multiplex PCR assays that some of you may have heard of. And now we're going to include COVID-19, SARS-CoV2 as part of this panel as well, going forward. So every season we'll have this full panel PCR test for any respiratory swab you take from an adult or a child. And these viruses can actually cause infection in the upper or the lower respiratory tracts, usually both. Some of them are confined to the upper respiratory tract, the common cold viruses, typically rhinovirus, coronavirus. But some of the others, like influenza, parainfluenza, RSV, can cause lower respiratory tract infections, like bronchiolitis in children and pneumonitis in adults. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of basically how you do it. You just take a swab from a patient, adult or child. We run it through a semi-automated platform. We have an extraction, a separate extraction platform for this particular unit, the Oz Diagnostics unit. And then we use the extract in the actual PCR platform that you see there at the top on the right. And then, interestingly, we've been testing viral loads in respiratory swabs for about 20 years now, since SARS 2003. Prior to that, when I was training as a registrar, we wouldn't do quantitation on a respiratory swab. Because if you think about it, if you take it from the nose or the mouth or the throat or the cheek, you might get a slightly different result. But to be honest, actually, it doesn't really matter in normal life. If it's positive, then you can treat it, or you just isolate isolate them. And if it's negative, you can look for some of the diagnosis of their respiratory distress. But now we can quantify it so accurately, we can compare viral loads and how they change over time with different viruses and in response to different treatments, and even in children versus adults, and immune suppressed versus non-immune suppressed patients. It's very useful now. Next slide, please. So this is the virus that's been causing us all this trouble. This is a coronavirus. It belongs to a large family of coronaviruses, both animal and humans. We have 4 coronaviruses that we know of for seasonal common cold viruses, which you'll see in the next slide. And the virus is basically a sphere with protrusions. And those protrusions look like a crown if you look at it from the side in 2D, hence the name corona, which means crown, coronavirus. And we've got several more lethal forms of this virus that we know of already. SARS-CoV2 from Hong Kong and Southeast Asia, which is now gone. We haven't seen it come back yet. And then Middle East respiratory syndrome virus, which is still around from camels to humans, but probably originally from bats as well. And then we have this new COVID-19 coronavirus, which again is from bats and causes more severe infection. And if you look at the bottom left there, you see that the viruses can be divided into several bits. The outer layer, where the S protein is, and the S protein is important for vaccine targeting and also entry to the cells. And also the inside of the virus, where the polymerase enzymes are that replicate the genome that allow progeny virus to develop inside a host cell. And that S protein binds to the ACE2 enzyme, which is the receptor for ACE for SARS-CoV-2, just like it was for SARS-CoV-1 in 2003. And it also is the receptor for one of the other common cold viruses, NL63, which is interesting because it may compete for that receptor in real life. Next slide, please. So this is a complicated diagram, but just shows the life cycle of the coronaviruses. And the big red ring there is where the drug remdesivir polymerase inhibitor works in severe cases that require oxygen dependency, ICU support. And we need to understand the life cycle of all these viruses, and we do this for HIV and for hepatitis B, influenza, etc. So we know where we can target these antivirals if we need to. The other drug that we use is dexamethasone, which basically reduces the immune response to the virus infection to reduce the severity of clinical disease, and which is a different kind of strategy from this particular drug, remdesivir. Remdesivir just stops further viral replication. So for those of you who know about antibiotics, all antivirals are actually only virostatic. They're not virucidal. They're not like penicillin that destroys the bacteria when you give it. So you rely on the host immune system to actually clear the virus. So for those who are immune suppressed, the virus may be shed for a long time because they're not clearing it. But interestingly, the immune response to the virus is also blunted, so they get less severe disease. So during this COVID-19 pandemic, we haven't seen a lot of excess mortality in the immune suppressed patients, the transplant patients, those on chemotherapy. We haven't seen a massive excess mortality in those patients, partly because the host immune system response to the virus is suppressed and they don't get that severely ill, above and beyond their underlying disease, of course. Next slide, please. So this is a nice diagram showing the diversity of the coronaviruses. So look at top left, 11 o'clock position are 2 common cold coronaviruses, OC43, HKU1. HKU1 was discovered at the Hong Kong University in Hong Kong by Patrick Wu and colleagues. Bottom right, at about the 5 o'clock position, are the other 2 common cold coronaviruses, 229E, NL63. NL63 is the one that shares a common receptor with SARS-1, SARS-2 coronaviruses. And these 4 common cold coronaviruses have been in the human population for years, centuries, even thousands of years, millennia. And they have adapted very well to the human population. They cause very mild disease. They're very transmissible. And that's probably what the SARS coronavirus 2 COVID-19 is going to end up as over time. A bit like flu. Bottom left is 7 o'clock position, the MERS coronavirus, the camel origin coronavirus, MERS. And then at the 8 o'clock position, you see SARS-1 and SARS-2 that have been causing us problems this year and back in 2003. And these are basically phylogenetic viral genetic distances shown on this, this tree diagram. Next slide, please. So where did this virus come from? So there's lots of concerns about bats and Chinese eating bats and other wild creatures. And we think that maybe the handling of the bats, just like the handling of chimpanzees for bushmeat in West Africa for Ebola, may have caused this zoonotic transmission of the virus. And we know that in Hong Kong and China, there are lots of wet markets that sell wild animals, and there's lots of cross-transmission ongoing. And this is where we think, we know that the previous pandemic influenzas have come from ducks and pigs transmitting via humans to give those transmissible genes through mixing of different hosts. And this is probably this is almost certainly what happened with the coronaviruses, SARS-1 in 2003 and now SARS-2 in 2020. Next slide, please. So this is going way back to December 2019, where there's this kind of trickle of cases around the Wuhan wet market. And then when they started looking more closely, you can see on the right-hand side towards the end of January last year, there's an explosion of cases because they were looking more, they found more cases, and then they got concerned that this was actually a real outbreak. And those of you who follow ProMed would have seen that early posts suggest that, oh, there's something going on in Wuhan, we're not sure what it is, requests for further information, etc. And then the Wuhan CDC went in and started testing everybody. And so they must have had an assay for this virus already prepared when they did that. Next slide, please. So this is the Wuhan pictures from the Wuhan wet market showing the various animal produce for sale. When I lived in Hong Kong, I went to these markets just to have a look around, and we even bought some chickens and some live fish from these markets. This is very culturally traditional in Chinese society. But of course, that opens up a lot of risk to zoonotic infections, as we've been seeing. And those of you who read Chinese, you can see at the bottom left, it's not very high resolution, you have a menu of different wild animals you can actually pick to bring home with you. And they normally kill them at the market when you request them. So you choose your live chicken or your animal, and you go away for a few minutes, and you come back and they've already they've already killed it, defeathered it, and even jointed it and put it into plastic bags for you. It's very efficient, but because of that, there's lots of contact and lots of risk of zoonotic transmission, cross-transmission in these markets. Next slide, please. And then, of course, you take it home and then you have to prepare the food, and that preparation can cause infection through microabrasions and cuts, and you may get infected from handling just the raw meat. And we know this also happens in Western countries when they're handling seafood and crabs and crustaceans. They carry some nasty bacteria as well that can cause infections just through handling the raw animal, the raw meat. And the various recipes, there's bull bats, bull skin bat, and the snake picture on the right was an early image where we thought that the snakes actually consumed the bats and got infected by the virus. And then when you consume the snake, you get the virus as well. This is now disproven, but it was a nice idea at the time. Next slide, please. And then the other vector is what we think the pangolin is the pangolin. And the pangolin is used for Chinese medicine. And when you sample the virus from the pangolin, it actually lies between the human and the bat on the phylogenetic tree. So it may be an intermediate host. So bat to pangolin, pangolin to human, because of this, this contact between the three different hosts. So you can see that this virus is actually very versatile. It can actually transmit between different mammalian hosts quite easily. And as it transmits, it adapts to different hosts over time and may well become more transmissible and less lethal, because it doesn't want to kill the host. If you kill the host, the virus will die as well. So that's not really what it wants to do. And we may be seeing this in the human population now with all these different mutants arising to give more transmissibility, but not more severe disease in the human population as well. Next slide, please. So this is a nice early tip dating study where you look at data sequences collected over several months from the human population. You can actually extrapolate it back from the current day to when they think the virus emerged in the human population. And we think based on this data, this early sequence data, is around October, November 2019. So you may have seen some reports of patients being diagnosed with this COVID-19 disease earlier than January, when it was actually made public to the rest of the world by China, because people are probably traveling to and from China even before that and picked up the virus traveling through Wuhan, for example, and brought it back to wherever they're from. And they could have masqueraded as influenza, because that's during the influenza season. And no one had an assay back then. So if it's influenza negative, despite having symptoms, it could be some of the virus, like the first panel I showed you earlier, that actually didn't have an assay for that patient in that hospital. So not all hospitals will have that pan PCR assay for respiratory viruses. They only may have an assay for, like, a few viruses, and then they just put it down to some of the virus if it wasn't influenza positive, but they wouldn't realize it could be a new coronavirus, for example. And of course, in Italy, they found some sewage suggesting that the virus had been there even before January 2020. Next slide, please. So this is really just an epidemiological concept. So basically, if you have, and this is the same for other viruses, if you have a known number of positive symptomatic patients at the top of the pyramid, you almost certainly have a much larger part of the pyramid where there are mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic patients that you don't know about. And this is particularly the case for HIV. HIV, we know, has a very tiny top on the pyramid that we know about, and perhaps a much larger base at the bottom. That base is getting smaller now because we do a lot of asymptomatic and anonymous testing, so we know that about 1 in 3 people don't know they're positive for HIV. But at the beginning of the HIV pandemic, it was much higher. Perhaps 4 out of 5 people didn't know they were positive for HIV at the very early stages of the pandemic, when there were very limited testing kits around. COVID-19 is similar. We know that now, having been through this for a year, about 1/3 of COVID-19 patients are maybe asymptomatic or mildly or pre-symptomatic, and we may only know about 2/3 of them, and that's in adults. For children, it's almost the other way around, where probably 2/3 of children are asymptomatic and 1/3 or even less might be symptomatic. So there is an age-related difference in the proportion who are symptomatic and those who are not with this infection. And that affects the screening and the infection control quite significantly. Next slide, please. So this is some of the early modeling from Imperial College, this magic R number. They can model outcomes with different ranges of R number. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we're thinking that the R number is around 2 to 4. So R0 is really the ideal basic reproductive number, where if you have a population of uniformly distributed susceptibles and you put one infected case into that crowd of susceptibles, you'll get so many cases arising from that single index case. And the number of secondary cases is the R number. Now, of course, in real life, we don't stand around waiting to be infected by a single index case. We're moving around, we have cars, we have houses, we go to school or offices or supermarkets, etc. So the R0 is really the idealistic number that you would discuss when you're looking at the ideal situation of a uniformly distributed susceptible population. Whereas in reality, the R without the 0 is what we hear about in the news every day. And that basically includes all the social distancing, or the masking, or the asymmetrical movements that people are doing. We don't have people standing in the streets waiting to be infected, per se. And you can see that it models from 1.1 to 3.5 worst case scenario, and the numbers of cases that would arise because of that R number changing. Now, the R number does not tell you how the virus is transmitted. Okay, so this is a very common misunderstanding amongst the population and even some scientists and physicians. People say measles has an R number of 15, therefore it must be airborne. That's true, but then airborne anthrax with spores, airborne hantavirus from rat urine that's aerosolized, they actually have R numbers of 0 because you get no person-to-person transmission. The R number really describes person-to-person transmission. You can have airborne hantavirus, airborne anthrax with the R equals 0 because you don't get person-to-person transmission. So be very careful about using the R number to infer a mode of transmission. And the opposite may be true. If you have an HIV mattress party with one person infected, infecting like 15 to 20 other people who attend that mattress party, the R0 might be, 10 to 15, but HIV is definitely not airborne. Okay, so it can work the other way around as well. So the circumstances are very important when you're discussing the R number. Next slide, please. So this is an early study from the NEJM looking at viral loads over time. So the CT, those of you who know about PCR, as the CT value drops, the viral load actually goes up because it's the number of cycles you need to reach a certain threshold. So here you just see that it's an inverted y-axis. So just to make it easier to read, the viral load drops over time, and probably for a COVID-19 patient, by day 15, there's hardly any virus picked up on PCR, day 15 to 20. But we also know now that beyond day 10, there's not much live virus there either. And the reason for that is because by day 10, you get a fairly decent immune response if you're not immune suppressed that then neutralizes and reduces that viral shedding, that live virus shedding. So the drop in viability coincides with the immune response that arises in most otherwise immune competent people. And you see here that the PCR detection drops off fairly quickly after about day 15 here. Next slide, please. Now this is a nice study from Ben Cowley and co from Hong Kong, where they actually showed that the transmissibility using paired infected and infectee patients can actually stop even before symptoms. Now this is very important because the degree to which you can control an infectious agent really depends, given our current technology, really depends on how much is transmitted before symptoms appear, because before symptoms appear, you don't suspect them of being infected with anything. So again, if you look at HIV, for decades, we couldn't control it because people don't know they're infected. They carry on passing the virus without being symptomatic. So they won't go and seek healthcare. They won't go and seek treatment. They won't go and seek advice on safe sex. This virus is similar in the sense that you can be actually transmitting the virus for up to 5 days, 5 to 6 days in some cases, before you actually get symptoms. And you may never get symptoms. And for those who get symptoms later on, you can be shedding the virus for 2 or 3 days before you get symptoms. And by the time you actually get symptoms, go for a test and get isolated, you may have spread that virus to like half a dozen people, 5 to 10 people, for example. And that's where you get that base of the pyramid being so big with this virus. And this is why this virus is so hard to control if you get beyond a certain threshold of cases. Now, if you look at places like Taiwan, look at places like New Zealand, they locked down very quickly so that all they had is a trickle of cases that they could actually quickly isolate and then identify the contacts, quarantine them, and test everybody exhaustively. If you get to like 10,000 to 20,000 cases a day, like we did in the UK, and now 50 to 60,000 cases a day in the UK, track and trace will not work very well. And we can see this now, because by the time you've actually tracked and traced somebody, they've already spread the virus to maybe 5 to 10 other people, because they've been infectious for the past 4 to 5 days already. So this virus is very hard to control from that point of view. Next slide, please. Now, this is a nice example in a care home in the US where they showed that, at least in these elderly patients who are 70 plus, I think, those with symptoms, typical symptoms, those with atypical symptoms, those who are pre-symptomatic, and those who never developed symptoms, in fact, all of them had similar viral loads. They cover the same range of viral loads. So some people say, well, asymptomatics don't transmit, asymptomatics aren't a risk. That is totally wrong. And that was the strategy back in the early part of the pandemic in the UK and elsewhere, where people were not testing the asymptomatics because they thought they wouldn't transmit, which may be true for some of the viruses, but not this virus, as we learned to our misfortune, unfortunately. Next slide, please. This other slide shows that those who have more severe disease and those who have milder disease may have the same viral loads. Okay, so these are two important points. Symptomatics, asymptomatics may have the same viral load. Those with more severe versus mild disease may have the same viral load. Okay, and this makes sense to some extent. If you think about long COVID can affect those who are actually mildly symptomatic and don't even need hospitalization. Okay, so the virus there stimulates the immune response in a different way, in a more kind of chronic subclinical way, to cause complications for a long time, like fatigue or shortness of breath or reduce exercise tolerance, for example, or even neurological complications and psychological complications as well. So be very careful when someone says to you very confidently, oh, they're asymptomatic, they can't transmit, just like children. Oh, they're asymptomatic, or they're not very ill, so they won't have much viral load. Okay, so this is wrong. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is a complicated panel, but if you look at the top right, you see the first evidence of viral neutralization by day 8. So if you look at those who have seroconverted, you see that shortly after seroconversion by day 8, day 9, culture positive stops. Okay, so the culture positivity stops after about day 8 because of that seroconversion to a sufficient level of antibody that can opsonize and neutralize the virus, and then the positive culture stops. And there's several other studies like this which led the WHO to then instigate a discharge criteria document, which you can Google online. Those of you who have phones, if you just Google in WHO and discharge criteria and COVID, you'll see that a guidance will pop up, and references 8 to 11 are similar studies to this, where they showed that virus neutralization by antibody response occurs by about day 10. So then they say, in otherwise immune competent patients with COVID-19, even if the PCR is positive to like day 15, 20, 25, most of the live virus shedding would have stopped by day 10, particularly if you can measure an antibody response, because the antibodies will actually neutralize the virus and suppress viable virus shedding. Next slide, please. Okay, so how can we transmit it and control it? Well, I think Prof. Chris Liu gave a very nice overview of this aerosol transmission, so I don't need to spend too long on this. Next slide, please. So this really captures in a nutshell what Prof. Liu was talking about earlier. Now notice I haven't put any numbers on here because the distance traveled depends on the local environmental circumstance. If you are a normal, competent person with COVID, breathing, talking in front of a air conditioning unit that blows your exhale breath down,
health around us. The minister is constantly emphasizing our appreciation for the team.
So someone's talking. You
service and the cabinet subcommittee. What has been done is strategic.
Dawn Grosvenor. All right, that's interesting. So this droplet nuclei idea is where the aerosol comes from, the airborne component. Droplets are large droplets, but in fact you can't separate large droplets from aerosols when you're talking or breathing. They're produced together. And then surfaces, well, when they land on surfaces, they may become contaminated. You can touch them and they self-inoculate. But in fact, there's actually no study showing that. There's no study showing that if you touch a surface that contains a virus of some sort, you self-inoculate, and then you follow up that patient and then you sequence their virus and they get infected and get symptoms, and you compare it back to the sequence of the original virus in the droplet that was on the surface to show they're the same. No one's done that study. Now, interestingly, WHO and other national healthcare institutions want the same evidence for airborne transmission. So of course the evidence requirement is different for airborne versus surfaces. In fact, there's no evidence for any respiratory virus that surface transmission actually transmits the infection. You can Google it till you're blue in the face. No one's done a sequencing match to show that virus A in a droplet on a surface causes disease in a patient 1, who then sheds virus A, confirmed by sequencing. That hasn't been done. Yet they want that kind of proof for airborne transmission, which is a bit unfair. So being a precautionary approach, infection control should really control the airborne transmission, because to be honest, we've been washing our hands for the last 12 months till we're blue in the face, and this virus is spreading even faster than it had before. So clearly hand washing is not working. So a lot of my aerosol colleagues say it shouldn't be hands, face, space, it should be space, face, hands, because your hands, in fact, CDC, US CDC, and even the PHE, the UK government here, actually says that hands and contact is not the main way this virus spreads. Next slide, please. So this is an excerpt from the CDC that actually says what I've just mentioned. If you look down, that from touching surfaces, they say it can spread this way, but this is not the main way this virus spreads. It's not, if it was spreading this way, all the surface cleaning, hand washing would work, and it's clearly not working. And in fact, a nice study in a Nature journal, Nature Human Behavior, compares all the different interventions across all the different countries that have been mandated by governments. They found that the most effective means of controlling this virus is social distancing, lockdowns, which will actually control every mode of transmission. But interestingly, the least effective across all those countries, all those mandates, is surface cleaning and track and tracing. Because if you track and trace, you have to make sure that those people are isolated and quarantined, stay in isolation and stay in quarantine. And if you can't control that, it's no good. And we can see that in UK and other European countries, and certainly the USA as well, I suspect. Next slide, please. So this is the system I built in Hong Kong. It cost me about $1 million to build this, including 2 postdocs and paying volunteers to cough, breathe, sneeze, sing in front of the mirror for several months. And the type of images you get, you can actually Google them because I put them all online with the help of one of the, an IT consultant in Singapore. And you can see real-time images of people breathing and talking, sneezing, coughing, singing, with this mirror. You get a shadow graph or a Schlieren image. Next slide, please. So what you see is this type of image, but it's moving. So I know that Zoom is not good for showing movies, so that's why I didn't bother this time. But if you copy and paste that link below into your phones, or you just Google Schlieren, S-C-H-L-I-E-R-E-N, and talking, and Tang, Julian, you might see this video pop up on your phone. And what you'll see is that when you talk, you push puffs of air to the other person and vice versa, and you can inhale them. And this is what I call the garlic breath distance. It's typically within 1 meter. That distance between the 2 heads is about 1 meter. And if you can smell the garlic breath or alcohol breath in your colleague after they come back from lunch, then you're inhaling some of the virus as well if they're infected, because you've got to inhale their breath, garlic or alcohol on their breath to smell it. And if they've got any virus infection and they're exhaling that, you'll inhale that as well. So if you see this image online, it's almost like, you know, we're breathing cigarette smoke. In fact, that smoke is actually the air you breathe out. And it's visualized because the air is warmer when you breathe it out. It causes a diffraction pattern, or a diffraction in the light pattern. And then you can see how the air moves over time in real time. Next slide, please. And we know from studies in the labs that airborne virus can stay viable, so we can culture it for about 3 hours. And in fact, there's another study like this showing that, in fact, it can be viable for up to 16 hours. Now, of course, these are lab conditions, but you see that on the surfaces, copper tends to kill the virus very quickly. Cardboard and wood also tend to be less friendly to the virus. But in fact, steel and plastic are the most friendly to the virus, with survival on surfaces up to 2 to 3 days. Next slide, please. And this is one of the studies that shows that if you talk, you produce aerosolized droplets. If you talk louder, you produce more droplets. So if you shout and sing at high volume, you produce lots of droplets. That's why singing in choirs and shouting and making loud noises is discouraged in most infection control guidance now for COVID-19. Next slide, please. And there's another study showing that if you sneeze, you can produce a turbulent cloud of aerosol from your breath for several meters. And the droplet distribution is important. The size is 1 to 5, 1 to 10 microns. You can inhale those and they can travel long distances. And then the larger droplets above 100 microns in diameter will fall to the floor, where they can act as thermite contamination for further onward transmission by hands. But again, that's relatively minor component of transmission for this virus. Next slide, please. So this is a study we did in Finland. I have a group in Finland that works with me. We use mannequins and we use tracer gas. We use air samplers, and this is actually using the live influenza virus vaccine that we give to primary school children here. We aerosolize that and we try to capture it from various points around the bed, from this patient mannequin. And we found influenza virus at the foot of the bed, by the abdomen, and also by the head in various quantities. So basically, and this is a patient using a nebulizer. So nebulizers can actually be aerosol generating procedures and can disseminate patients' infectious breath over several meters to healthcare workers, especially if they're not masked. Now, of course, the ventilation does help with this, as Chris properly was showing. If the ventilation can extract the exhale breath away from the healthcare worker, and that's what this project was about. It's a €300,000 project we did in Finland. Then that would enhance the protection for healthcare workers within the isolation room. Next slide, please. Now, planes, how safe are planes? I have so many interviews about planes. So basically, planes are very safe because the ventilation rate is huge. In a plane, the ventilation rate is about 20 to 30 air changes per hour. That's once. The air change occurs over 1 to 2 minutes for the whole fuselage of the plane, which is really fast. Nothing else on the terrestrial built environment has such a massive ventilation exchange rate. However, people are very tightly packed into the plane, so basically the distance between you and your neighbor could be just half a meter. And if you're talking without masks on and you can smell your neighbor's garlic breath or alcohol breath across that distance, you've already inhaled their virus, even before the ventilation system can actually take it away. So in fact, I've had some conferences with Boeing looking at this kind of risk, and they've made a lot of effort to reduce this risk to get people back onto planes. And some of the measures they've been doing, both surface cleaning and airborne aerosol removal, have been very effective, at least in their mock-ups anyway. Next slide, please. And that's why you wear masks on planes, because the ventilation doesn't protect you 100%, hence you saw on that picture. Now, we have found a viable virus in the air in a couple of studies, and this one from Nebraska, and the next one, next slide please, from Florida, using a very gentle air sampling device in the Florida study in particular, because the air sampling actually pulls the virus from the air into a liquid medium very quickly, and that shears the virus, it disrupts the surface membranes, and so it's not surprising the virus is no longer viable when you try and culture the virus from those air samplers. So studies that show that no viable virus from air sampling using conventional air samplers really just show that the virus is likely disrupted during that process. But when you breathe or cough or sneeze into the air, your breath is traveling much slower than these air samplers used to sample the air. So these air sampling studies probably underestimate significantly the amount of viable virus in the air. And of course, don't forget that the main transmission occurs from face-to-face contact, conversational contact, not just from the air volume that you walk through, where the virus is very diluted. The concentration of virus between two people talking is much higher than would be if you're just air sampling around a patient, a few meters away. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the control, PPE is right at the bottom because it's the least effective in a sense, because it depends on how you use it and the material you use. Whereas if you look further up, the engineering controls are basically the ventilation system that are basically non-human dependent controls. You just turn it on, you leave it on, and it will remove contaminants from the air at a regular rate, depending on the local ambient airflows, opening, closing doors, using diathermies, operational lights, etc., etc. And also human movement will also disrupt this ventilation flow. But at least the ventilation flow is there. And those of you who have commissioned operating theatres or seen them commissioned, they commission an operating theatre ventilation system without anybody in it. They use settle plates, they use tracers or smoke tracers. But once you have all the lights on, the diathermies, the anaesthetic machines in, then 4 or 5 bodies, the surgical team, anaesthetic team, and then 4 or 5 medical students, all that commissioned ventilation airflow is totally disrupted, and you don't know actually what's going on in there. Next slide, please. Okay, so universal masking, properly covered some of this, but basically studies have been done in the lab that show that if you wear a surgical mask, you can reduce the outflow of aerosol from your mouth and nose by about half to a quarter, okay? And then the person that you're talking to who's wearing a mask, that reduced aerosol flow from your mouth and nose then is reduced further by their mask that can reduce that incoming aerosol by another half to a quarter. Okay, some studies suggest that, in fact, you can actually contain enough virus to reduce your outflowing virus if you're infected by down to 1/6 if you're wearing a mask. So these effects are multiplicative. So let's just stick to the simple one where you reduce the outgoing virus if you're infected by 1/4, and then if you're wearing a mask and the virus aerosols coming towards you, you can reduce that incoming aerosol by 1/4 as well. So in fact, the protection is 1/4 times 1/4, which is 1/16, which is a lot. So if there's 1,000 viruses that you're exhaling, if you're infected, by the time it gets to the other person, if you're both wearing masks, it's down to like about 67 viruses, 1/16 of 1,000, okay? So universal masking helps from that point of view, because both the source and the recipient are masked and reduces the exposure to the virus aerosol. Not only that, the masks are leaky. So there's another idea which I thought was quite interesting from NEJM, that you have low level exposure to the virus that can actually boost any immunity that you have already. And if you don't have immunity, you may well be inoculated by that low level of virus that you inhale and become immune through that low level exposure, because that's what vaccination does. So that's a nice, interesting idea, hard to prove though, of low level, what they call variolation. Some of you may have seen that paper in NEJM. And also the masks have other advantages. If you're wearing a mask, people see you're wearing a mask, people are more naturally careful. So they may actually do more hand washing, more social distancing, because the mask reminds them, oh, hey, you know, I've got to put a mask on, I've got to be careful about contact with the virus. And this actually is, it works in the opposite way to what people used to say, that if you wear a mask, you take more risky behavior. That hasn't been shown to be true. So the risk compensation behavior argument is no longer valid. We think that, in fact, wearing the mask makes you more careful in other ways as well. Next slide, please. There's one of the studies done in the UK back in 2008. So when the government was saying that there's no evidence that masks work or don't work back in March, April, that was totally wrong. This is a government study. This was done after SARS 2003, but before pandemic 2009. Okay, and this shows very clearly that if you wear a mask, it contains the virus very effectively. It can reduce incoming aerosols by 6-fold. And later on, it shows that it can actually contain viruses by about 2- to 4-fold. This is a long document. Okay, so there was evidence for this, and there's other documents, studies like this done before 2020, showing that masks are actually very effective in containing droplets, aerosols, but also reducing incoming aerosols if they're worn properly as well. Something's better than nothing. It's not that masks don't work or they work. Everything works to some degree. Okay, so all this binary thinking has caused a lot of confusion in this pandemic, and it's really, the responsibility of the ministers, the government, to actually message clearly and accurately. And if there is uncertainty, you just say there's some uncertainty. Otherwise, people believe you that they don't work or they do work, and if there's any kind of exception, they'll say, well, you said it always works. Well, now it doesn't work. So then you get very confused about what to believe and what not to believe. Next slide, please. This is a nice study from Don Milton's team where they showed that if you wear a mask, you can reduce the amount of outgoing aerosol by 3- to 4-fold. So again, if you combine that with the masking of the against the incoming aerosol, you can actually reduce that that exposure by up to 24-fold, 4 times 6, for example. And also, he showed here that the small particles actually carry more virus than the large particles do, which seems counterintuitive. But it may be that the smaller particles have some are more easily aerosolized and maybe less viscous, and they may carry more virus because of that. So there's some dynamics in the physiology of the salivary mucins in the mouth, because when you have some salivary mucins like GP340 that can contain viruses and bacteria, by trapping them in more viscous areas of the saliva, but some of it, when it leaks out into the less viscous, more easily aerosolizable fraction, you may get more virus released, and maybe that's how this new more transmissible strain of the virus, the UK variant B117, is being transmitted, because more of the virus ends up in the less viscous, more easily aerosolizable fraction of your saliva oral mucosa. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is actually just some pictures from the 2003 and the current most recent pandemic, COVID-19, showing the innovation of the Hong Kong people in finding ways to protect themselves. So the bottom left is a water cooler bottle with the bottom cut out, and you even have a chimney so you don't get fogged up at the top where the opening is. And he's also wearing a mask and glasses as well. And top right, you see a couple sharing a bra because there were no masks in 2003 as well. They ran out of masks, so they shared a bra. Next slide, please. And children can wear masks. Okay, they say in the UK, children under 11 don't need to wear masks. Well, we know that children actually shed virus, just as much virus for just as long as adults do. And in Southeast Asia, they, in the countries that you can see, they wear masks, they wear visors, they even have little cubicles for themselves. And they actually are fine with that. We don't see protests of parents marching down the street saying, my kid doesn't want to wear a mask. So the kids can be trained to wear masks, and they wear them very effectively in places like Taiwan, that had over 200 days without a single case, as well as Vietnam, Thailand, and Japan and China. Next slide, please. So the vaccines, I think this is what everyone wants to hear. So the list of vaccines is shown there that at the time I wrote this was available, were in clinical phase 3 trials. And as you know, Moderna, Pfizer, and the Oxford vaccine have been licensed now, and the Russian and Chinese vaccines are being used anyway during the phase 3 trials to the public. And you can see that the different designs of vaccines are shown here. Okay, so there's a protein subunit, that's at the 10 o'clock position. That's the same as the current flu vaccine. Then at the 2 o'clock position, there's a recombinant virus vaccine. That's the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine and the Russian Sputnik 5 vaccine. Nucleic acid-based mRNA at 4 o'clock position. That's the mRNA vaccines, and also DNA vaccines, though we don't have any of those ordered for the UK. And then at 7 o'clock, you have the inactivated vaccine. That's the whole virus that has been inactivated and purified and then put into an injection for the vaccination. And in fact, we used to use the whole virus for flu vaccination, but what they found is that although it's very immunogenic, you get a very good response, protective response to that, it's very reactogenic. So the adverse effects were just as bad as the flu. So people didn't take the vaccine because you weren't guaranteed to get the flu. If you took that vaccine, the whole inactivated virus vaccine, you definitely get flu-like symptoms in most cases. So they stopped doing that and switched to a subunit style flu vaccine that just has an HA protein in it, which is much less reactogenic, so fewer side effects, but it's also less immunogenic. Now, GSK and Sanofi, that you can see on the left there, they've applied the flu vaccine technology to the COVID-19 vaccine, but they've had problems because it's not immunogenic enough. They've had to reformulate it and find an additional adjuvant to try and boost the immune response to that subunit S protein vaccine design. Now, the other vaccines that you may not have heard about, Novavax and Valneva. Novavax has been bought by the UK, you'll see that in the next slide. It's a subunit protein like the GSK Sanofi vaccine, like the flu vaccine, just containing the S protein. And then the Valneva is the whole inactivated virus vaccine, just like the Chinese Sinovac vaccine. Okay. And the reason why the government's bought all these different vaccines is because some people may react to, say, the S protein only sufficiently. We can't tolerate the whole virus inactivated protein, whole inactivated virus vaccine. Whereas some may not respond to any of the vaccines except the whole inactivated vaccine, whole inactivated virus vaccine, because they need that immunogenicity to produce an immune response, protective immune response to the virus. Okay, so clinical trials for those subunit and whole virus vaccines are coming out, are actually ongoing at the moment. Next slide, please. So each of these vaccines has some disadvantages and advantages. So the Russian Sputnik 5 is an adenovirus vaccine, so is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. They use a non-replicating adenovirus vector, but that vector can actually create a host immune response that will neutralize the vector later on. So if, for example, we need to have repeated boosters of the COVID-19 vaccine, after a few shots with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the Russian Sputnik 5 to some extent, you may lose efficacy because your host immune response, your body creates antibodies to the adenovirus vector that can neutralize that adenovirus vector and the response and the virus and the vaccine response before it even gets to your muscle dendritic cell and starts inducing antibodies. This has been seen in adenovirus vectored anti-cancer vaccines, which is where this technology comes from. So this is a serious concern. So after this year, once everyone's got the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, what they're not saying, but they're very aware of this, that if you give this vaccine to several billion people around the world, if that vaccine needs repeated boosting, you can't use the same vaccine forever. You're gonna have to switch your adenovirus vector. Now at the moment, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine uses a chimpanzee adenovirus, which you don't see in humans, which is fine. But after this year, when we've vaccinated a lot of people with this adenovirus vector vaccine, you will create antibodies to that adenovirus vector, because that's what we do. The Russian Sputnik 5 is interesting. It uses an adenovirus 26 for the first dose, and then an adenovirus 5 for the second dose. So they're different adenovirus vectors. They produce less of an immune response to one specific vector, but again, over time, they will lose that efficacy because your own body will produce antibodies to those two vectors eventually, and they'll have to switch vectors at some point. You can see on the second box on the right, they have different degrees of immunogenicity. In real life, we have to see what they really are. Clinical trials are only very limited, and they produce both a B and T cell response, as you can see from the red box on the left. Next slide, please. So the Pfizer-BioNTech Moderna mRNA vaccines, this is a new technology, but in fact, it has been around for a long time. There are phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials ongoing with mRNA vaccines against Zika virus, rabies, even HIV, CMV, for example, but they've never reached phase 3 clinical trials and licensing like the COVID-19 virus vaccines have. So both the adenovirus vector vaccines that we just saw and the mRNA are really new virus vaccines for the general population. The mRNA vaccine works by inserting a code, just the code, into a lipid nanoparticle for the S protein that's then translated in the muscle dendritic cells in your deltoid when it gets injected there, and that produces an antibody response in the systemic immune system. We don't know how long that's going to last for. They're going to extend the interval between the first and second dose to try and roll out the vaccine to more people. Pfizer-BioNTech have advised against that, as have WHO. But I think that the first dose will be fine. The first dose will produce an immune response, both B and T cell, and it will last for some time. It will last longer than 21 days for sure. How long it will last, we're not entirely sure, but some of the data shows that they have an immune response well beyond 21 days. Does it last up to 3 months? We're not sure, but we think the priming of that immune response may well induce memory B and T cell responses, so-called the anamnestic response, that will retain some protective effect even up to 3 months. Plus, you may well get community boosting from exposure to circulating wild-type virus, which is widespread in the population now. But 1 in 50 people are actually infected with this virus at the moment. So if you have one dose, then you go to the supermarket 2-3 weeks later, and you stand beside somebody who's exhaling the virus, that virus may actually boost your immune response to that virus that was primed by the first dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna and the Oxford AstraZeneca. Next slide, please. So this is a nice summary diagram showing how they all work. So the number 1, protein-based, like the flu vaccine, subunit of the virus protein, that's the S protein, induces an immune response. Number 2 is your mRNA vaccine, your adenovirus vector vaccine, where the S protein code is inserted into adenovirus vector, and that produces an immune response by coding for that virus S protein. And then the mRNA at the bottom, the mRNA actually codes for the S protein directly, so it gets translated into the, once it gets into a deltoid muscle cell or dendritic cell, and produces the S protein to induce the antibody response. And it also produces a T cell response as well. So all these vaccines produce B and T cell responses to different extents. Next slide, please. So for the Mrna, there's a nice picture showing the injection into the deltoid and then uptake of the mRNA by deltoid muscle cells and by dendritic cells, producing the S protein on the surface of the cell that then induces an antibody response and a T cell response in the recipient. And there was some talk about, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine produces a stronger antibody response than the mRNA vaccines that produce a stronger T cell response. So mixing and matching the vaccines would be a good idea. If you have one dose Pfizer and one dose Oxford AstraZeneca, you cover both bases. But in fact, probably both of them produce sufficient immune response to start with, and then you get community boosting from exposure to the wild type virus that's circulating at the time, and probably will circulate for some time despite the vaccine program. Next slide, please. So this is interesting. The mRNA vaccine that we're talking about most of the time, the Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech, are 2 doses of non-replicating mRNA. So you need 2 doses to boost that response. Now, there are so-called self-amplifying, self-replicating mRNA vaccines, which you see at the bottom there. The Arcturus vaccine being made in Singapore, and also the Imperial College vaccine that we've not heard much about recently. They're working on self-amplifying, self-replicating mRNA vaccines that may work with just 1 shot. Just like the flu vaccine, we give 1 shot and that's it. If you can give 1 shot and forget about it, and the virus, the mRNA self-replicates inside the host cell, boosting and amplifying that immune response, that's much easier for people to live with. You get 1 shot, you walk away, just like the flu vaccine. You don't have to go back. I haven't seen any data on that. The Imperial College group hasn't published any data on that. Arcturus haven't published any data on that so far, but the trials are ongoing. So that'd be very interesting to see that, because if you can have 1 dose of an mRNA vaccine that's self-replicating, self-amplifying, and you can change that code fairly quickly to fit any mutation of the virus going into the future, that could be a very cost-effective way of immunizing basically everybody. So I'm just waiting for these results to come out. Next slide, please. Okay, so the prime boost thing, let's talk about the prime boost thing. So the priming is where you get a new antigen injected into you, whether it's flu or hepatitis B or rotavirus or COVID-19. That's the prime, and the priming induces the B and T cells to produce antibodies and T cell responses, and then a proportion of those cells go into a longer immunological memory cohort, and then they may stay activated or at least primed for life. And then when you get a booster dose of the vaccine, or you get exposed to natural infection, that primed response then reactivates and then gives you a sudden boost of antibodies, sudden boost of activated T cells that recognize the antigen already. So it's a very quick response. You don't have to wait 2 or 3 weeks for that protective effect to kick in once you've been primed. So this prime boost strategy is followed for most vaccines. If you look at, but they have variable intervals between them. So if you look at the 6 and 1, what we used to call DPT and HIV vaccine, the meningococcal vaccines, the rotavirus vaccine, the chickenpox vaccine, most of these vaccines, except for flu, use a prime boost design. And that's what the COVID-19 vaccines are doing. All of them are 2 doses. Next slide, please. So here's the nitty gritty. So you can order that many millions. They've actually ordered so much vaccine that they can actually vaccinate the whole population twice over. And the current phase of the trials is shown in the bottom right there. And of course, Moderna has now been approved in the US and UK. And the others, Novavax, Valneva, GSK, and Janssen are on the way. Next slide, please. Now, how effective are they? Okay, so let's look at this is peer review by press release. Okay, so also AstraZeneca, we know 60 to 90%, depends on which dosing regimen you use, etc. Moderna is about 95, Pfizer-BioNTech is 95, and the Sputnik 5 has been claimed to be 92. Okay, so we've seen some of these figures in the press. I haven't seen the detailed publication, except for the AstraZeneca that published 3 Lancet papers. The cost is on the right, much cheaper for the AstraZeneca vaccine, much more expensive for Moderna, Pfizer, and in the middle for the Sputnik 5 from Russia. But don't forget, like I said, the adenovirus vector vaccines will not remain efficacious for forever, because your host immune response will start to clear that adenovirus vector. So they're going to have to change that probably in a year or two's time to maintain that efficacy. Whereas the mRNA vaccines can just be redesigned forever. We don't really see any kind of neutralization, anti-vaccine neutralization response to the mRNA vaccines so far. Now, of course, they're not all on there. There's some missing. The Chinese vaccine is missing, but we'll see that in a minute. And we don't have data on the other vaccines that are reaching phase 3 at the moment. But again, that will come with time. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, so I put this in because you might want to know, where do these 95, 94% come from? Well, it's a relative risk calculation. In fact, this, because it's on my Apple, it's a bit distorted. But basically, you do 1 minus relative risk calculation, 1 minus RR, and that's A over A plus B over C plus D, something like that. A over A times B over C over C times D. There's a formula at the bottom there, which I can't see very well. It's very small here, but A over A plus B over C plus D, I think it is. And then you can do that for yourself if you pull out the right data from the papers. It's quite easy to do, and that's where they get those figures from. Next slide, please. And the question is, what do you call an endpoint? So I think Chris was saying earlier that you can protect yourself from severe disease and hospitalization, but you can't stop yourself from transmitting. Well, to some extent, that might be true for a lot of the vaccines, because we don't actually use transmission, onward transmission, as a parameter when we actually roll out the vaccine. We tend to reduce the severity of illness and reduce hospitalization. That's the main kind of endpoint. In fact, we see breakthrough infections with vaccines quite a lot. The chickenpox vaccine isn't 100% efficacious. We see vaccine escape mutants for hepatitis B, and there's generally a 5% failure rate of any vaccine in any population due to various immune variability. So the endpoint of a clinical trial for vaccine efficacy is quite important to understand before we start comparing them. Next slide, please. So Chris asked me to add a whole bunch of extra slides to cover different things. So this is what the extra slides are. So sorry if I'm going over time here. But the Chinese Sinovac vaccine is a whole inactivated virus vaccine. The claim is 50 to 90% efficacy, in the Brazil-Turkey trial. And the other inactivated virus vaccine that the Chinese have produced is called Sinopharm, very similar to Sinovac, Sinopharm, with a similar kind of range of efficacy that's been claimed in at least the United Arab Emirates trial, 79 to 86%. And it's also been trialed in Indonesia and Turkey, Indonesia and Pakistan as well. So probably all these vaccines work to some extent fairly well, probably at least 50% efficacious, which is better than nothing. So just on the terminology, efficacy is really within a clinical trial design. Effectiveness is actually the efficacy in a real life situation outside the clinical trial. So what we call probably phase 4 post-license monitoring. And you can see the other figures below, which we've mentioned already. And the size of the population that you measure these figures in is important, because you want to pick up any kind of variability and adverse effects as well. Next slide, please. Now, the question on the first dose efficacy and delay in the second dose. So we only have data for the Oxford AstraZeneca trial. And the reason for that is because the Oxford AstraZeneca trial was so complicated. They had different protocols in different countries. They had trials in UK, Brazil, South Africa, USA, and they even used different controls for the first and second dose. So for example, in the UK, the control for the first and second dose was meningococcal vaccine. In Brazil, the first dose was against the meningococcal vaccine, but the second dose was against saline. And in South Africa, it was against saline in the first and second dose. And even the dosing intervals were different. So in the UK, the first and second dose could be 8 to 12 weeks apart. In Brazil, it could be 4 to 12 weeks apart. And only in South Africa, it seemed to stick to a 4 to 6 week interval more rigorously. But ironically, because of that, only the AstraZeneca vaccine has this kind of 12-week data showing that if you give one dose, then you can actually maintain a protective effect for at least 12 weeks, which is about 84 days. So if you look at this graph here from the last of the 3 Lancet papers, the phase 3 paper looking at Brazil, South Africa, and UK, if you look at the graph on the right first, days since first standard dose, okay? And then the y-axis shows the number of positive cases of COVID-19, PCR positive cases of COVID-19 against the placebo, which is the blue line, and then the vaccinated, which is the red line. Again, the shading is confidence intervals. So you can see that even at day 120 up to day 150 on the graph on the right, you see there's a difference between the numbers infected in the vaccinated and non-vaccinated arm of the population, even after just one dose. So you can see that the protective effect after one dose, one standard dose, extends out to 150 days, which is well beyond 12 weeks, 3 months. Okay, that's 5 months. Then if you look at the graph on the left, days since second dose, the protection's greater, which is what you expect. The second dose boosts the effectiveness of the first dose, and you see a much larger, well, it's not that much larger, a slightly larger difference between those vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated against the placebo. So that's some data showing that the efficacy, effectiveness, protectiveness of the first dose and is quite extensive, goes up to like 120, 150 days. And then if you vaccinate after 90 days, 3 months, you'll boost that protection as well. But also don't forget, when you're out and about in the community after one dose, that exposure to the wild-type virus circulating in the community will also boost your immunity that's been primed by that first dose. So that's why myself and other experts in the UK suggest that that first dose, the delayed second dose, won't be a big deal. And if the virus is still circulating, that will boost your immunity after the first dose. Now, this data is only available for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. We haven't seen it for Pfizer-BioNTech, and they're a bit nervous because they haven't got this data and people are going outside clinical trial parameters. And of course, they're worried, especially in the US, where they have lots of medical litigation. But even a prime for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine may well have that kind of response. We're not sure yet about the mRNA vaccines. That's why, because they're so new. But your immunity won't suddenly just drop off at day 21 if you don't get that second Pfizer-BioNTech dose. Next slide, please. Okay, so the variants, let's talk about these variants. Now, the variants in virology, they happen all the time with HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, influenza. This is normal for viruses. And you define a variant by the type of mutations they have and also the genetic differences. So if you sequence COVID-19 virus, coronavirus, SARS, coronavirus 2, about 30,000 base pairs. And if you sequence another virus from a different patient, and the difference is like 2 or 3% in those nucleotides, it might be a different clade, okay? And beyond that, you can actually say, well, look, this virus has 501Y mutation, as you see in this UK variant, across 20% of the population. And it also has a 6970 del mutation, which goes along with the 501 in a certain proportion of that population. So you define a new lineage, a new clade, new variant that way. For the UK variant, this 501Y is in the receptor binding domain. Next slide, please. So this receptor binding domain is basically where the virus attaches to enter a host cell, but it's also where the neutralizing antibody binds as well. So if you have too many mutations in this area, the antibody that you induce from the vaccine or from exposure to the previous circulating strain of the virus may not bind that new virus and neutralize it as well. So you can see from the image there, it's like a bit of, almost like a kind of upside down pear. If you imagine that that pear shape changes a lot in that area, in the kind of, so you can see it's about 11, so 1 o'clock positions where the receptor binding site is. If it mutates a lot in that RBD, your antibodies will not bind to it very well, and you may get some ongoing, you may get some viable virus that escapes the antibody effect and causes infection and then some disease, but probably mild. Okay. If you have a delayed second dose, what people are worried about is that if you only have one dose and that one dose doesn't induce a strong enough antibody response to neutralize all the virus that you might be exposed to, can some of the virus that does infect you and replicate actually then be selected for against the antibody response to that first dose? Because it's a selection pressure. That is possible. Yes, that is possible. But then my argument is that, look, if you only immunize half the population with 2 doses and the other half of the population with no doses, when they get infected, the virus can replicate much more rapidly, and by chance, some of them will produce a vaccine escape response as well. Obviously not in the presence of that particular selection pressure, but they may produce other mutations as well. So it's very hard to say which is the worst situation. At the moment, given you're getting 50 to 60,000 cases a day with 1,000 deaths a day, I think it's more important to immunize as many people as possible, even at that 50 to 60%, 70% efficacy level, to reduce the number of places this virus can actually replicate. Because you need to stop the replication to stop resistant vaccine escape or drug-resistant mutations arising. And we know this from decades of experience with influenza, HIV, hepatitis B, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so the South African variant, if you think about what I've just told you, this South African variant has 3 mutations in the S spike glycoprotein. It's got 501, which was present in the UK one, but it has a 484K and a 417N. So now you've got 3 mutations in the receptor binding sites domain, and this is why some of the scientists are worried that this South African strain may escape the existing vaccines more readily than the UK variant. Okay, because if you've got multiple mutations in that binding site, the antibodies induced by the vaccine based on the older circulating virus strain may not bind as well. This is possible. Okay, this is possible. We see vaccine escape mutants all the time with influenza. We see it with hepatitis B as well. This is actually not that surprising. And this virus is still adapting to the human host. It's still mutating to enhance that symbiosis, survival instinct, survival modification. Because what the virus wants to do is infect everybody and kill nobody. Because then the virus and the person just stays in this kind of harmonious symbiosis, like we see with the common cold, etc. Okay, so the virus doesn't want to kill its host because otherwise the virus will die as well. So for both of these virus variants, we don't see more severe disease, not so far. There may be some higher risk of vaccine escape with the South African variant, but we think it's not that high. So relative to the UK one, it might be more of a risk for the South African variant. We don't think it's that high because there's a lot of the spike glycoprotein that the antibodies can bind to as well. Now, how did they calculate it being more transmissible? So this is tricky. What they did, and there's several studies showing this, is that they looked at the growth, the proportion of positive samples that contain these 2 variants in those different populations. And what they found is that a higher proportion of the virus contained these mutations in both the South African and the UK population over time. So let's say in October, 20% of the population with positive samples had this variant. By November, it was 40%. By December, it's 60%. So you see that that virus is becoming predominant across the population over time in both South Africa and UK. Now, there is a confounder to this, what we call a founder effect. Okay, so for example, if say in October, there was let's say in October you had a normal population with just a low level of this virus circulating, then in November you had some kind of rave party or a wedding or a funeral that a few people who had this variant attended, and you get an explosion of cases in that particular population, that wedding, that funeral, that rave party, and they all tested positive and they were all sequenced, and you think, oh, there's a massive surge of the UK variant in this population in November, but you know what, they all belong to this particular event, and that event is a founder event. Okay, so we weren't sure whether that was the case, and also people socializing post-lockdown, coming out of lockdown, pre-Christmas shopping, into the streets in tier 2 in London and South East may have kick-started that virus spreading through the population. But once it starts to spread and starts to become dominant because of that effect, that founder effect, eventually it doesn't matter because that virus will have spread to like 80–90% of the population. So any transmission you get, even if it's normal transmissibility, will become predominant in that population. And we know this because there's another virus mutation back in the spring, D614G, that looks like it was more transmissible, or looked like it should be more transmissible. So it had higher viral load in culture, it had a higher viral load in swabs, but it did not translate that into a more transmissible variant across the population. And what happened was it had multiple seeding in multiple countries where it spread in a more conventional manner in those countries and became predominant in some of those countries. So there are different subtleties about how this virus transmits before we can call it enhanced transmissibility. Right, I've almost finished now. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think it's the last one. So the question is, will it disappear completely like SARS 2003? No, I don't think it will. Whether it's going to cause sporadic problems like MERS and avian flu around the world at different times and different populations, I think probably not. I think it's gone beyond that. But I think it will become truly seasonal, like RSV, like paraflu, like influenza, like the seasonal coronaviruses, but with that extra mortality built in for those who are elderly with comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, etc. And probably the main population may stay more vulnerable to it because they're more predisposed to those clinical comorbidities. And then, of course, you need to boost the immunity with regular vaccination, maybe seasonal boosting, or maybe every other year, because we know that reinfection with the seasonal coronaviruses only occurs like every 1 to 3 years. So you may get the situation like influenza, where you have influenza jab in one arm 1 week and a COVID-19 jab in the other arm the following week, especially if you're in the vulnerable group, elderly and those with comorbidities. So that's what I think is going to happen. And if you ask me, when do you think we're going to get out of the pandemic? Like I said, to many reports say you will get out of the pandemic when you hit probably around a 60% herd immunity with this more transmissible strain, plus or minus the South African strain that's going to come. And that may be maybe April, May, or even June, July. Depends on how fast we can get the vaccine out and how well people actually hunker down and stop this virus spreading further whilst the vaccine's being rolled out. Okay, thanks for listening. I've gone over time a lot. Sorry about that. I hope it was useful. I'll try and answer any questions if we have any time left for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And we have been at capacity, lots of people logged in. And unfortunately, because of our limitation of our license, lots of people could not log in. That was a tour de force. Thank you very much indeed. There are some questions, but I'm afraid that we have really run out of time. So it just remains for me to thank you, Julian, and also our 2 medical students who hosted today. So see you all at our next webinar, which will be the first Thursday evening of February, when we talk about medical training in the pandemic. And it will be, once again, a double act between our Director of Education, Mr. Khalida-san, and the President of the Royal College of Physicians, Professor Andrew Goddard. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Speak again soon.